The story of Gideon, Judges 6-7. Gideon lived during a difficult time in Israel's history, a period marked by oppression and hardship. For 7 years, the Israelites were brutally oppressed by the Midianites, a nomadic people who would invade their land, destroy their crops, and steal their livestock. The Israelites were forced to live in fear, hiding in caves and strongholds, as their land and livelihoods were ravaged year after year. In their distress, they cried out to God for help, hoping for deliverance from their enemies. One day, Gideon, an ordinary man from the weakest clan of the tribe of Manasseh, was threshing wheat in a winepress, hiding it from the Midianites to avoid having it stolen. It was there, in his moment of fear and frustration, that an angel of the Lord appeared to him, addressing him with a startling greeting. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Surprised and doubtful, Gideon questioned the angel, asking how God could be with Israel when they were suffering so much. He recalled the stories of how God had rescued their ancestors from Egypt, but wondered why God seemed to have abandoned them in their current plight. The angel, undeterred by Gideon's doubts, told him that he was chosen by God to deliver Israel from the Midianites. Gideon, however, was filled with insecurity and fear. He considered himself insignificant, unfit for such a monumental task. He responded to the angel by saying, "But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Despite his hesitations, the angel reassured him, promising that God would be with him and that he would strike down the Midianites as if they were a single man. Still unsure, Gideon asked for a sign to confirm that it was truly God speaking to him. He prepared an offering of goat meat, bread, and broth and presented it to the angel. The angel touched the offering with the tip of his staff, and fire flared from the rock, consuming the offering entirely. Realizing that he had encountered an angel of the Lord, Gideon was filled with awe and fear, but God reassured him, saying, "Peace, do not be afraid. You are not going to die." That night, God gave Gideon his first task, to tear down his father's altar to the false god Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. In its place, Gideon was to build an altar to the Lord and offer a sacrifice. Though Gideon feared the reaction of his family and the townspeople, he obeyed. Under the cover of night, he and 10 of his servants carried out God's instructions. When the people discovered what had happened, they demanded that Gideon be put to death for destroying Baal's altar. However, Gideon's father, Joash, defended him, arguing that if Baal were truly a god, he could defend himself. From that day forward, Gideon earned the nickname Jerubbaal, meaning "let Baal contend." Soon after, the Midianites and their allies gathered in the valley of Jezreel, preparing to invade Israel once again. In response, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he summoned the men of Israel to fight against their oppressors. But Gideon, still uncertain, asked God for another sign to confirm his promise. He placed a fleece of wool on the threshing floor and asked that, if God intended to save Israel through him, the fleece would be wet with dew in the morning while the ground remained dry. The next morning, Gideon found the fleece soaked with dew, enough to fill a bowl with water while the ground was dry. Even after witnessing this miracle, Gideon's faith wavered, and he asked God for yet another sign. This time, he requested the reverse, that the fleece remain dry while the ground around it be covered with dew. God graciously fulfilled this request as well, and Gideon finally gained the confidence he needed to proceed with the mission. With his faith strengthened, Gideon gathered an army of 32,000 men to face the Midianites. However, God had other plans. He told Gideon that the army was too large, explaining that if Israel were to win with such a sizable force, they might take credit for the victory rather than acknowledging God's hand in it. To reduce the numbers, God instructed Gideon to send home anyone who was afraid. 22,000 men left, leaving Gideon with just 10,000. But God said the army was still too large. He instructed Gideon to take the men down to the water and observe how they drank. Those who lapped the water with their hands, bringing it to their mouths, were chosen, while those who knelt down to drink directly from the stream were sent home. In the end, only 300 men remained. These 300 were all that God needed to bring victory to Israel. Gideon, though likely anxious about the size of his force, obeyed God's command. God, knowing Gideon's fears, told him to go down to the Midianite camp that night with his servant Purah and listen to what the enemy was saying. When Gideon did so, he overheard a Midianite soldier recounting a dream in which a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the Midianite camp, overturning a tent. Another soldier interpreted the dream, saying, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Encouraged by this, Gideon returned to his camp and prepared for battle. That night, Gideon divided his 300 men into 3 companies. He armed each man with a trumpet and an empty jar with a torch inside. At Gideon's signal, they blew their trumpets, smashed the jars, and shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The sudden noise, light, and confusion caused the Midianite army to panic. In their terror, they turned on each other with their swords, and the survivors fled. Gideon's 300 men pursued them, and Israel won a decisive victory. The story of Gideon demonstrates God's power to accomplish great things through seemingly weak and insignificant people. It shows that when we trust in God's plan, no matter how improbable it may seem, He can deliver us from our greatest challenges. Gideon's journey from fear and doubt to faith and victory reminds us that success comes not from our own strength, but from relying on God's strength and guidance.